Millionaire marries an ugly beggar for a bet, but what he discovers on the wedding night leaves him paralyzed. The ballroom gleamed under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved gracefully, carrying trays of champagne and refined appetizers, while the guests, dressed in their impeccable attire, exchanged fake smiles and empty conversations about investments and high society scandals. At the center of this spectacle of opulence, Thomas Montgomery reigned supreme. Tall, elegant, and with a cold, calculating gaze, he exuded power. His name carried weight in business circles, and his fortune was a source of envy for many in the room. However, his arrogance was as vast as his wealth. To Thomas, everything and everyone had a price. Leaning against the bar, William Walker, a longtime friend of Thomas, watched him with a sarcastic smile. William was different. Though he belonged to the elite, he saw the world with a little more humanity. And above all, he loved provoking Thomas, especially when it came to his inflated ego. "So, Montgomery," William raised his glass of whiskey, looking at him with amusement, "do you still think you can buy anything?" Thomas arched an eyebrow, bored. "Why wouldn't I? Everything in this world has a price. The secret is knowing the right one to pay." William let out a short laugh and took a sip of his drink before landing his decisive blow. "Right. And what if I told you there's something that not even your entire fortune could buy?" Thomas crossed his arms, now slightly intrigued. "I'm listening. You always brag about getting anything you want. But could you turn a woman from the streets into a lady of high society? Better yet, could you marry her and make it last for at least 3 months? The provocation caused a murmur among those nearby. Some curious guests moved closer. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "Is this a joke, Walker?" "No, Montgomery, it's a challenge." William swirled the ice in his glass before locking eyes with his friend. $2 million says you'll fail." The defiant spark in William's gaze ignited Thomas's pride. He hated being underestimated. He had never lost a bet, and he wasn't about to start now. $2 million? Thomas smirked, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "Too easy." William leaned in, his expression full of provocation. "Then prove it." The silence among the onlookers was broken only by the sound of Thomas's glass being placed on the bar. He extended his hand toward William. "Deal." They shook hands, sealing the bet. While William smiled with satisfaction, Thomas was already calculating his next steps. Finding a woman from the streets wouldn't be difficult. The city was full of them. He just had to pick the right one. The next morning, the sun beat down on the city center. Thomas drove his sports car through the bustling streets, scanning the alleys and sidewalks where society's invisible figures huddled. Men and women, dirty and exhausted, struggling to survive in a world that ignored them. He pulled onto a quieter street and stepped out, adjusting his pristine suit. He needed someone who, with the right adjustments, could pass as a lady. She couldn't be too old or too worn by life on the streets. That was when he saw her. Sitting on the sidewalk, curled up against a stained concrete wall, Sophie White hugged her knees in a futile attempt to keep warm. Her tangled, dirty brown hair partially covered her face. Her clothes were nothing more than rags, barely serving their purpose. But what truly caught Thomas's attention was her eyes. Even in misery, even invisible to the world, those eyes burned with a fire, a contained rage. Perfect. Thomas approached, and sensing his presence, Sophie lifted her gaze. The disdain in her expression was immediate. "I don't have anything to give you, if that's what you want," she said, her voice hoarse and tired. Thomas chuckled softly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Funny, because I have something to offer you." Sophie frowned, suspicious. "I'm not interested. You don't even know what it is." "I don't need to. People like you never offer anything for free." Thomas smiled. He liked her defiant spirit. "You're right. My offer comes with a price. But before you say no, maybe you should hear it." Sophie scoffed, but the growl of her stomach reminded her she had no real choice but to listen. "I'm listening." Thomas crouched slightly to meet her at eye level. $1 million. She blinked, startled. "What?" $1 million. And all you have to do is marry me for 3 months. Silence. Sophie blinked a few more times, trying to process what she had just heard. "This is some kind of joke, right?" "No, it's a deal. You move into my house, learn to live as a lady of high society, and at the end of 3 months, the money is yours." Sophie let out a breathless laugh. "You want to buy a wife? I want to make a transaction. You need money. I need someone for an experiment. We both win." Sophie studied him, searching for the trap. A man like him would never do anything without a hidden motive. "And what happens if I say no?" Thomas shrugged. "Nothing. You stay here, living the way you do." The words hit her like a blow. It was cruel but true. She had nothing and no one. Sophie looked down at her dirty, bruised hands. She had suffered too much. She had already lost everything. This was just another humiliation. But at least it was one that could get her out of this life. She lifted her eyes to Thomas. "I want a written contract." He smirked, satisfied. "Done." Sophie took a deep breath, feeling as if she were about to step off a cliff. "Then I accept." Thomas extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, she shook it. Their fate was sealed. The wedding was arranged with the efficiency and impersonal nature of a business transaction. No romance, no emotional vows, no warm celebration. For Thomas Montgomery, the event was nothing more than a necessary formality. And for Sophie White, it was a ticket out of hell. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning, in a private hall at one of the city's most luxurious hotels. Only a few guests were invited, just a handful of prestigious businessmen, old friends of Thomas, and a few socialites who thrived on scandals disguised as exclusive events. Sophie wore a simple white dress, chosen by Thomas's advisory team. No intricate lace, no delicate embellishments, just a plain fabric, almost dull, as if to remind everyone that she was no conventional bride. She looked at herself in the mirror before stepping out for the ceremony. She still didn't look like a wealthy woman. Her features were clean, yes, and her skin no longer carried the grime of the streets, but the way she saw herself remained the same. An intruder in a world that didn't want her there. When she entered the hall, the silence was crushing. Everyone watched her as if she were an anomaly amidst the perfection of the setting. Sharp gazes, whispered comments hidden behind champagne glasses. "My God, has he lost his mind? It must be a bet. Look at her, she looks like she walked out of a shelter yesterday." Sophie lifted her chin. She wouldn't let them humiliate her. Not anymore. Thomas was already at the altar, dressed in a flawless suit, wearing the same bored expression as always. To him, this meant nothing. When their eyes met, Sophie knew he expected nothing from her beyond obedience and discretion. The officiant conducted the ceremony quickly and mechanically. "Thomas Montgomery, do you take Sophie White as your lawful wife?" "I do." His voice was firm, but devoid of emotion. "Sophie White, do you take Thomas Montgomery as your lawful husband?" She swallowed hard. The word burned on her tongue, but she knew there was no turning back. "I do." The rings were exchanged without any tenderness. No kiss, no smile. Just signed papers and curious witnesses documenting the moment. When the ceremony ended, Thomas turned to the guests and made an impatient gesture for dinner to be served. He had no intention of prolonging the evening more than necessary. Sophie barely had time to breathe before being pulled from one side to another, subjected to comments disguised as polite greetings. "You must be very happy," a woman in an expensive dress said, her gaze laced with venom. What a twist, huh? A businessman shook Sophie's hand with a fake smile. From Beggar to Montgomery's wife. Who would have thought? The humiliation hit her like a wave. She felt the knot tighten in her throat, but refused to give in. If they expected her to bow her head, they would be disappointed. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed indifferent. With each veiled provocation, he simply smiled and changed the subject. To him, Sophie was nothing more than a project. 2 hours later, the reception was over. Thomas and Sophie left the hotel without any display of affection. No dance, no toast, just a quiet exit and a driver waiting by the door to take them to the Montgomery estate. Thomas's mansion was far from the city center, surrounded by high walls and imposing iron gates. When the car stopped at the main entrance, Sophie took a deep breath. This would be her new home or her new prison. The doors opened and a group of staff members awaited them. All impeccably dressed, their expressions neutral and their postures flawless. Thomas stepped out first, not looking back. Sophie hesitated before following. As soon as she took her first step inside, she felt their judgmental gazes fall upon her. A woman with graying hair, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform, approached. "Is this Mrs. White?" Her voice was cold. "Mrs. Montgomery," Thomas corrected. "And yes." The woman studied Sophie from head to toe before giving a slight nod. "I am Elizabeth, the housekeeper. I have been informed of the situation." "Your quarters are ready, ma'am." The situation. Sophie held her breath. This entire house saw her as a burden. Thomas walked past her without so much as a glance and headed toward his office. Before stepping inside, he simply said, "Come with me." She followed him into a luxurious space filled with expensive furniture and an elegant fireplace at the center. He sat behind the desk and opened a drawer, pulling out an envelope. Here are the rules," he said, tossing the envelope onto the desk. Sophie picked up the paper and quickly scanned it. No unwanted public exposure. No interaction with the press. No physical contact or public displays of affection. Follow all required etiquette and behavioral instructions. 3 months, no failures. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. "Impressive, not even a welcome to your new home, or I hope you're comfortable." Thomas leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "We're not here for sentimentalities. You'll receive your money at the end of the term. Until then, do your part." She clenched the paper in her hands. "And if I quit?" Thomas smirked. "You go back to the streets without a cent." A chill ran down Sophie's spine. She had expected him to be cruel, but hearing it so plainly was different. She took a deep breath and lifted her gaze, defiant. "Don't think you can treat me like an object, Montgomery." He arched an eyebrow, surprised by her boldness. "We'll see." Sophie knew this wouldn't be easy, but if Thomas Montgomery thought he could tame her, he was gravely mistaken. The first day of training began before the sun had even risen. Sophie was jolted awake by firm knocks on her bedroom door. Still groggy, she opened her eyes to find Elizabeth, the housekeeper, standing there with her usual impassive expression. "Get up. Your training starts now." With no time to protest, Sophie was dragged into a luxurious bathroom where a team of hairdressers and beauticians were already waiting. There was no gentleness, just a meticulous protocol to erase any trace of the life she had lived before. Her once dirty and unruly hair was washed, treated and brushed until it shone. Her nails were filed and painted. Expensive products were layered onto her face, erasing the marks of poverty. When she looked at herself in the mirror, Sophie barely recognized the woman staring back. But it wasn't just her appearance that had to change. She was led to a private room inside the mansion, where a tall, thin man in a perfectly tailored suit was waiting. "I'm Edward," he introduced himself, analyzing her with a critical gaze. "From today onward, I will be your etiquette and posture instructor." Sophie crossed her arms. Great. And how long will this last? Edward smirked. Until you stop looking like you. Sophie bit her tongue to keep from snapping back. The next few hours were hell. She had to balance books on her head while walking back and forth, keep her back straight despite the growing pain, and speak slowly without showing emotion. She learned how to hold champagne flutes and silverware without seeming out of place. Your posture is still wrong, Edward corrected for what felt like the 100th time. And maybe that's because I'm tired of feeling like a walking mannequin, she shot back. You can't afford to be tired. People like you have to work 3 times harder to be accepted. His words hit her like a slap. That was it. She wasn't welcome here. Thomas and his elite circle were just waiting for her to fail, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The following days were a constant battle. Sophie attended speech lessons, where she had to pronounce words as if she had never lived on the streets. Your intonation still carries traces of a simple life, pointed out the rigid speech instructor, a woman who seemed carved from stone. Maybe because my life was simple. Well, forget it. The physical training was just as intense. Dance instructors drilled graceful movements into her, while posture trainers adjusted every detail of her stance. By the end of each day, her body ached, and her patience was wearing thin. And as if that weren't enough, Thomas made a point to observe her from a distance, always with that critical gaze and his ever-present smirk. On the 4th night, after watching her stumble during a posture exercise, he chuckled and approached. I thought you were tougher, he remarked, leaning casually against the wall. Sophie took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. And I thought you were less insufferable, Thomas arched a brow. So you still have the energy to fight back? Impressive. Sophie stood up, brushing off her hands. If you're waiting for me to quit, forget it. I'm leaving this mansion with $1 million in my pocket and my head held high. Thomas studied her for a moment, as if assessing something new. Then he smirked. Let's see how far that determination takes you. Slowly, Sophie began to notice the changes. Her body no longer slumped with exhaustion at the end of the day. Her voice had become steadier, more controlled. The instructor's gazes shifted from pure disdain to cautious admiration. But the real test came at a dinner with Thomas's friends. The table was filled with businessmen, socialites, and influential figures. It was the first time Sophie had been exposed to his social circle, and everyone was eager to watch her fail. Thomas, as always, seemed indifferent. Sophie, darling, a tall, slender blonde smiled at her with thinly veiled condescension. How does it feel to be the new Mrs. Montgomery? All eyes turned to her. The question was a trap. Sophie picked up her wineglass, took a sip, and smiled back. A challenge, but I like challenges. Some guests chuckled, surprised by her sharp response. And how has the adjustment been? Asked a businessman, clearly expecting her to admit discomfort. She held her composure. I'm still learning. But as they say, even diamonds need to be polished. This time the silence was longer. Thomas, sitting beside her, raised his wineglass, watching her with a different expression. She wasn't just surviving, she was starting to win. And for some reason, that both unsettled and intrigued him. The halls of Montgomery Enterprises were a reflection of their owner, cold, immaculate, and silent. Sophie walked alongside Thomas, observing the frantic pace of the employees, who carefully avoided making eye contact with their boss. That morning, he had asked her to accompany him to a meeting under the pretense that she needed to learn about business. But Sophie knew the truth. It was just another test. He wanted her to feel out of place, to understand that she would never belong in this world. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Dressed in an elegant business ensemble chosen by Thomas's advisors, she kept her head high and ignored the curious whispers of the employees murmuring behind her back. Then something hit her, a strange sensation, an unease in her chest. As she passed the reception area, a crushing sense of déjà vu washed over her. The environment, the scent of coffee mixed with expensive perfume, the muffled sound of ringing phones. This had happened before. Her heart pounded. She knew this place. And suddenly, the memories came rushing back like a punch to the gut. 4 years earlier. Sophie clutched a worn-out folder in her sweaty hands, her stomach twisted with anxiety. Her blouse was modest, but neatly pressed. Her hair was pulled into a simple bun. Her resume wasn't impressive, but she had experience and determination. She needed this job. Montgomery Enterprises was hiring administrative assistants, and for Sophie, this was a chance to escape a life of unstable jobs and financial insecurity. She waited patiently in the reception area until her name was called. When she entered the interview room, she found a man sitting behind a mahogany desk, reviewing documents with indifference. Thomas Montgomery. At the time, she didn't know much about him, other than that he was a young, wildly successful businessman. She took a deep breath and sat down. "Mr. Montgomery, I just need an opportunity. I know I didn't graduate from a prestigious university, but I'm hardworking and I learn quickly." He didn't even look up from the papers. Limited experience, average education, no relevant recommendations. Sophie clenched her hands in her lap. "I know I can prove my worth if you give me a chance." Thomas finally lifted his gaze and studied her for a brief second. Then he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "I don't waste my time with amateurs." The words hit her like a slap. Sophie froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. "What? You're not the type of candidate we're looking for." Next. The cold way he dismissed her shattered something inside her. She left the room with teary eyes, humiliated, crushed by yet another closed door. Another reminder that the world had no place for someone like her. And from that moment on, her life unraveled. Without that job, her savings drained, the debts piled up. The eviction came months later. And then, the streets, present. The realization hit her like a truck. She hadn't just met Thomas Montgomery before this forced arrangement. He was the man who crushed her without even remembering. Her heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to breathe. Thomas was giving instructions to a group of employees, completely unaware of Sophie's shaken expression. His tone was exactly the same as before, impersonal, arrogant, dripping with indifference. She clenched her fists, feeling anger rise inside her like an uncontrollable fire. He didn't remember her. Her entire life had crumbled that day. And to him, she was just another name in a stack of rejects. Nausea churned in her stomach. It all made sense now, the way he treated her, as if she were disposable. He had always been like this, but she was no longer the fragile girl who left that interview in tears. If Thomas wanted a game, then she would play. She wouldn't be just another disposable pawn in this bet. If she had to stay, she would leave stronger than she came. Sophie took a deep breath and, with a control she didn't know she possessed, forced a smile onto her lips. "Something wrong?" Thomas asked, noticing the shift in her expression. She blinked, swallowing the fury. "Nothing. I'm just learning a lot about you, Montgomery." He raised an eyebrow, suspicious, but didn't press the issue. Sophie glanced around, absorbing everything. The war had begun. The night was a spectacle of lights and wealth, a scene where only the most influential moved freely without question. Montgomery Enterprises Gala brought together the most powerful businessmen in the country, a true showcase of status and influence. Sophie felt the weight of their stares burning into her skin the moment she stepped into the ballroom. They didn't need to say anything. The message was clear in their condescending smiles and hushed whispers. Even so, she kept her head high, her steps steady, her posture flawless. Her dark blue gown glided smoothly over the floor, and every movement exuded the elegance she had spent weeks perfecting. She wouldn't give anyone the pleasure of seeing her falter. Thomas watched her from the corner of his eye, intrigued. He had expected hesitation, a misstep, some sign of discomfort, but to his surprise, Sophie moved among the elite as if she belonged there. When a group of businessmen approached, eager to get a closer look at the woman at the center of so much speculation, she greeted them with a poised smile and sharp eyes, ready to face any provocation. "So, Mrs. Montgomery," a blonde woman in a red dress began, her voice dripping with false warmth. "How is this new chapter of your life treating you? It must be quite an adjustment." Sophie met her gaze without flinching. She knew exactly what that question implied. An interesting adaptation," she replied, twirling her wineglass lightly between her fingers. "But I enjoy a challenge." The blonde raised an eyebrow, surprised by the firm response. "I imagine you do, but tell me, how did you two meet? Such an unusual story." A few guests stifled laughter, eager to watch her stumble. Sophie took a sip of her wine and calmly set the glass down. "Fate enjoys unpredictable games," she said with an enigmatic smile. "But I believe it's how we handle them that truly matters." Thomas, beside her, suppressed a smirk as he watched the woman falter, unable to push the provocation further. Sophie wasn't just handling the situation, she was winning. For the first time, he realized she wasn't a passive pawn in this game. She was playing for herself. As the night went on, to his dismay, Thomas found himself watching Sophie more than he should have. Every word she spoke carried conviction, her presence naturally commanding attention. She wasn't like the women he knew, those who followed the rules without question. Sophie challenged, she resisted, and for some reason, that both unsettled and fascinated him. The ride home was quiet. In the car, Thomas cast a quick glance at Sophie, who seemed lost in her own thoughts. "You did well." She didn't take her eyes off the window. "Did you expect me to fail?" "I didn't expect you to impress me." She let out a dry laugh. "I'm not here to impress you, Montgomery." He was silent for a moment before asking, "Then why are you here?" She turned her head, her eyes meeting his in the dim light of the car. "Because I have to be." He looked away and murmured, almost unconsciously, "So do I." Sophie frowned, caught off guard by his answer. Before she could question him, the car pulled up to the mansion. She stepped inside first, but noticed that Thomas didn't follow immediately. Instead, he remained on the veranda, staring at the dark sky. Something in his expression wasn't the same as usual. Sophie hesitated before approaching. "What is it?" Thomas took a few seconds before answering. "You probably think I'm just a cold, arrogant man." "I wouldn't be wrong." He smirked slightly, not denying it. "But there's more to it than that." She waited for him to continue, and to her surprise, he did. "My mother died when I was 7. My father never knew how to handle it, so he buried himself in work. I was raised by tutors and staff, people who were always too busy to care." Sophie remained silent, absorbing his words. She knew what abandonment felt like, the feeling of being invisible. "So you learned not to care either." Thomas met her gaze, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever seen. "I learned that no one truly cares." A tightness formed in her chest. He genuinely believed that. For a moment, a brief, unexpected moment, she wanted to say something to prove him wrong. But Thomas seemed to realize he had said too much. He looked away, straightened his posture, and took a step back. "Good night, Sophie." He turned and entered the mansion, leaving her alone on the veranda, staring at the stars. For the first time, she had seen something beyond the mask of arrogance and absolute control, but that didn't mean she would trust him. Not yet. Sophie had never trusted Thomas, but something had changed in the past few days. It wasn't a specific gesture or a misplaced word. It was the way he and William exchanged glances whenever she was around, discreet smiles that seemed to carry a secret. At first, she ignored it. She had learned how to shield herself from this world full of games and hidden motives. But over time, she began to notice patterns. Every time Thomas took her to an event, William would make some offhand remark, always with an amused tone. "You're doing better than I expected, Montgomery," he had said once, taking a sip of whiskey. "I never lose, William," Thomas replied, flashing that cold smile that irritated her. At the time, Sophie didn't understand the meaning behind their exchange, but the feeling that something was being kept from her grew, settling in her chest like an invisible weight, until one day she overheard Elizabeth speaking quietly to another employee. "The boss just needs to hold out for a few more months." Sophie froze in the hallway. She wasn't supposed to hear that, but the words made her breath catch. A few more months? What did that mean? After that day, her mind became a storm. The pieces began to fall into place in an uncomfortable way. Every exchanged glance between Thomas and William, every cryptic comment, every little detail she had previously overlooked. Something was wrong, and she needed to find out what. That night, she waited until the house was silent. The staff had retired to their quarters, and Thomas was locked in his office, as he always was before bed. Sophie knew she wouldn't have many chances. If she got caught, he would demand an explanation, and she wasn't sure she could lie convincingly. Thomas's office was a large space, lined with bookshelves and dark furniture. The only light came from the moon filtering through the window, casting ghostly shadows on the polished wooden floor. With her heart pounding, she began opening drawers, trying to be as silent as possible. Her fingers brushed over contracts, bank documents, everything meticulously organized. Nothing seemed unusual, until she found a different envelope, marked only with the initials V.R. William Walker. Her stomach twisted. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and pulled out the pages inside. The first words hit her like a punch. $2 million says you'll fail." Her vision blurred. The air seemed to vanish from the room. She read on, the cold, impersonal details of the agreement between Thomas and William laid out before her. 3 months. You have to turn her into a lady of high society and stay married to her until the deadline. If she quits before then, the bet is lost. $1 million for Sophie, $2 million for Thomas if he succeeded. She clenched her fists, feeling rage burn beneath her skin. It all made sense now. Every gesture, every order, every moment she had spent in this house without fully understanding her role. She was never anything more than a game. Her hands trembled so much that the paper nearly slipped from her grip. She closed her eyes, trying to suppress the wave of fury and humiliation threatening to consume her. Thomas Montgomery hadn't just bought their marriage. He had bet on her. Sophie took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay in control. Her first instinct was to confront him, to scream, to demand answers. But then she realized that wouldn't do any good. Thomas was a player. He handled challenges like business transactions. If she confronted him now, he would have explanations, cold justifications, maybe even that smug smile, as if it were all just another deal. And Sophie would not give him that satisfaction. She would leave this house, but she would leave on her own terms. She carefully folded the papers and placed them back into the envelope. Then she closed the drawer exactly as she had found it. She couldn't leave any trace. A plan began to form in her mind. She couldn't just run out the door. She needed money. She needed somewhere to go. If she disappeared overnight, Thomas would find her easily. In the following days, she pretended. She smiled when necessary, chatted with the staff without raising suspicion, responded to William's provocations with the same confidence as before. But inside, she was counting the hours. Thomas seemed to notice something was different, but he couldn't quite figure out what. "You're acting strange," he commented one evening as they ate dinner together, one of the rare occasions they shared the same space. Sophie looked up and smiled. Am I? Thomas studied her for a few seconds, then shrugged. Maybe it's just me. His instincts were right, but this time Sophie would play the game better than he ever could. She would no longer be a pawn in this bet. She would make her own move, and by the time Thomas realized it, it would already be too late. The night was silent, and the Montgomery mansion slept beneath a starless sky. Sophie stood by the bedroom window for long minutes, her heart pounding as her mind replayed the plan she had been crafting for days. She couldn't stay there any longer, not after what she had discovered. She had packed only the essentials, a few clothes, a coat she had discreetly taken from the closet, and a small bundle of food she had managed to hide during dinner. Money, however, was a problem. Thomas controlled everything. She would have to fend for herself, just as she always had. Taking a deep breath, she slowly opened the bedroom door, making sure the hallway was empty. The absolute silence was both an encouragement and a reminder of the danger. If she was caught now, she had no idea how Thomas would react. Her steps were careful, almost inaudible against the marble floor. She passed through the servants' wing, the grand hall, and finally reached the back door. The lock gave way easily, one last glance over her shoulder. Nothing but the cold darkness of a house that had never been hers. And then she ran. The first gust of icy wind made her shiver, but she didn't stop. She followed the driveway until she reached the main road, where she was no longer a prisoner of luxury, just a woman alone in the world once again. The night was cruel. The city, which during the day pulsed with movement, was now a concrete wasteland where only shadows roamed. Sophie had nowhere to go, no solid plan beyond getting as far away from the mansion as possible. As the hours passed, the cold grew sharper. Her hands were numb, her body trembling. She walked aimlessly, searching for shelter, but the streets offered no refuge. Every dark alley, every unfamiliar gaze brought back memories of her worst days. She had escaped a golden cage only to return to the hell she had once fled. Exhausted, she collapsed onto a bench in a deserted square. Her breath was uneven, her eyelids heavy. She just needed to rest, just for a few minutes. She closed her eyes, and the world faded away. Thomas woke with an unsettling feeling, a silent alarm ringing inside him. Something was wrong. He glanced at the clock. 3 in the morning. He sat up in bed, an inexplicable weight pressing on his chest. He walked to Sophie's bedroom door and knocked, waiting for an answer. Nothing. Frowning, he turned the handle. The room was empty. For a moment he didn't move, the shock freezing his reaction, but then instinct took over, and he stormed through the hallways, his heartbeat racing. "Elizabeth!" he called, his voice cutting through the silence. The housekeeper appeared, groggy. "What's wrong, sir?" "Where is Sophie?" Elizabeth blinked, confused. "In her room, The look on Thomas's face made her swallow her words. The entire house was searched within minutes. Sophie was gone. The air seemed to leave Thomas's lungs. His first reaction was anger. How dare she run? But then something even worse settled in. What if something had happened to her? Without wasting another second, he grabbed his car keys and left. He had no idea where he was going, only that he needed to find her. The streets were empty, and Thomas drove without direction, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow of the city. The worry gnawed at him, an unfamiliar sensation that he couldn't shake. He had never cared about anyone but himself. But now, the desperation inside him was consuming. After nearly 2 hours of searching, he stopped the car at a square. His gaze swept the area until something caught his attention. A figure curled up on a bench, motionless, her disheveled hair partially covering her pale face. Sophie. He moved without thinking, striding across the square with urgency. "Sophie!" She didn't respond. As he got closer, he saw how chapped her lips were, how her face was paler than usual. He touched her forehead and felt the fever burning through her skin. She was sick. Something tightened inside him. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. "You're not dying here," he murmured, his voice laced with an emotion he didn't understand. Sophie stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a brief moment. Thomas?" He pulled her closer. "Be quiet. You'll be fine." She didn't resist. She simply closed her eyes again, surrendering to exhaustion. Thomas rushed back to the car, not caring about anything except one undeniable truth. He couldn't lose her. The rhythmic sound of monitors filled the white hospital room. The sharp scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, and the soft glow of the early morning light cast shadows along the walls. Sophie lay in bed, her face pale, her breathing weak. Thomas sat beside her in an uncomfortable chair, unable to leave. He had spent the entire night there, watching her, waiting for her to wake up. Something inside him twisted in a way he couldn't explain. He had never cared about anyone but himself. But now, seeing Sophie like this, a knot formed in his throat. He remembered the moment he found her, alone, fragile, barely conscious on that park bench. The fear he felt when he touched her burning skin, realizing just how sick and vulnerable she was. Sophie was never vulnerable. She had always challenged him, always held her head high, even when the world around her tried to bring her down. But that night, he saw what truly happened when she was left alone, and he hated himself for it. William had been right. From the very beginning, this bet had been a mistake. Sophie should never have been a pawn in such a stupid game, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt like a complete fool. He stood up, running a hand down his tired face. He needed to do something. Pulling out his phone, he dialed William's number. His friend's voice came groggy on the other end. "Montgomery, it's 5 in the morning. Have you lost your mind?" "The bet is off." Silence. A long pause. "What?" Thomas clenched his jaw, guilt gnawing at every word. "I said it's over. You can take your money back." William let out a short laugh. "You lost the bet. That's a first." "I should have never agreed to this bullshit," Thomas growled. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Another silence. When William spoke again, there was no trace of irony in his voice. "What the hell happened to you?" Thomas looked at Sophie, still unconscious, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "I changed." And for the first time, he realized it was true. Sophie's eyes fluttered open slowly, blinking against the room's dim light. Her head ached, and her body felt impossibly heavy. She tried to move, but a weight on her hand made her pause. Thomas was there, sitting beside her bed, his head lowered, his fingers loosely wrapped around hers, unconsciously holding on. The sight sent a shiver through her. Thomas Montgomery, always impeccable, always in control, now looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. She tried to pull her hand away, and he stirred instantly. His tired eyes met hers. "You're awake." Sophie licked her dry lips, her throat sore. "Where?" "The hospital. You had a high fever and passed out." The memories rushed back all at once. The escape, the cold, the desperation, Thomas carrying her in his arms. Bitterness rose in her throat. "You brought me back." He ran a hand over his face, exhaling. "You were going to die out there, Sophie. I couldn't let that happen." She laughed, but it was an empty, broken sound. "Now you care." Thomas didn't answer. She wanted to scream, to throw all her pain back at him, but she was too weak, and fighting with him now was pointless. He seemed to understand that. Leaning forward slightly, his eyes more serious than she had ever seen them, he spoke again. "I called off the bet." She blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What?" "It's over. No more game. No more money." A storm of confusion filled her chest. Why? He hesitated before answering. Because I was wrong. Because you should have never been a part of it. She closed her eyes, trying to process his words. He was admitting it, admitting that what he had done was unforgivable, but was that enough? Thomas took her hand again, and this time she didn't have the strength to pull away. I don't know how to fix this, he murmured, his voice carrying something different, something real. But I want to try. Sophie didn't answer. Because for the first time, Thomas Montgomery sounded like he was telling the truth. But trusting him again, that was something she still didn't know if she could do. The morning sun filtered through the hospital curtains, casting a soft glow over the room where Sophie rested. She felt better, but her mind was still in turmoil. Thomas had been there for the past few days, and despite his constant presence, she still didn't know how to deal with him. Something had changed, but the fear of trusting him again kept her from admitting it. That morning when she woke up, she found Thomas sitting beside her bed, holding an envelope. As soon as he noticed she was conscious, he handed it to her without a word. Sophie frowned before opening it, revealing a stack of documents. What is this? Her voice was hoarse. The cancellation of the bet, the return of William's money, donations to various social organizations. She looked at him, searching for traces of the cold, calculating man she had known. But there was something new in his eyes. And why are you showing me this? Thomas let out a sigh, running a hand over his face, as if searching for the right words. Because I want you to see that I'm not that man anymore. Sophie held her breath. And you think a stack of papers can undo what you did to me? He didn't back down. No, but I need to start somewhere. She didn't answer. She didn't know what to feel. In the days that followed, after she was discharged, Thomas insisted that she accompany him. At first, Sophie resisted, but something about his determination made her give in. He took her to places she never imagined she would see with him: shelters, community schools, projects that helped homeless women, women like she had once been. Thomas hadn't just donated money, he was involved. He talked to people, looked them in the eye. It was real. Sophie watched everything, feeling her heart beat in an unfamiliar way. Was this the same man who, months ago, saw her as nothing more than a game? One afternoon, as they left a rehabilitation center for young people, she turned to him. Why are you doing all this? Thomas held her gaze for a long moment before answering. Because I want to be someone better. For a second, the ground beneath her feet felt unsteady. He didn't say he was doing it for her. He didn't say it was to make up for what he had done. He was doing it because he wanted to change. And that terrified her, because little by little, without realizing it, she had begun to believe him. Time passed, and the barrier between them started to fade. Sophie still challenged him, still didn't give in easily, but Thomas no longer lost patience. He just kept trying. Until one day, when she realized she no longer felt anger when looking at him, she knew something had changed within her too. That night, Thomas took her to a special dinner, far from grand events, far from the elite who judged them, just the two of them. Sophie should have known something was off, but when Thomas stood up, took a deep breath and knelt before her, her heart stopped. I'm not asking because of a contract. I'm not asking because of a game or any other reason except the fact that I love you. The world around them seemed to disappear. Marry me for real, Sophie. No bets, no obligations, just because I can't imagine my life without you anymore. Her eyes filled with tears. Months ago, this same man had bought her as if she were an object. Now, he knelt before her, vulnerable, waiting for her answer. Sophie closed her eyes and smiled. Yes. This time, when Thomas kissed her, there was no coldness, no pride, only love. Months later, the ceremony was nothing like the first one. No unnecessary luxury, no guests looking for a spectacle. Only the people who truly mattered. This time, Sophie wore a dress she had chosen, and when she said "I do," it was because she wanted to. Thomas was no longer the arrogant man who believed everything had a price. Sophie was no longer the woman who accepted crumbs. They had met in the middle. Some time later, when Sophie discovered she was pregnant, she hesitated before telling him, unsure of how he would react. Thomas was silent for a few seconds, then laughed, genuinely laughed, and pulled her into a tight embrace. "Isabella Montgomery," he whispered, his hand gently resting on her belly. "How do you know it's a girl?" she asked, smiling. He looked at her, his eyes shining with something new. "Because fate loves to challenge me." Sophie laughed, pressing her forehead against his. Thomas Montgomery had never lost a bet, but this time he had won something that no amount of money in the world could buy. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.